Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for being in this bunker. So we're gonna talk about crypto, and I guess we introduce ourselves first. So I'm Primavera de Filippi. I'm a researcher at the CNRS and a faculty associate at Harvard. And my research since the last 6 years now is on the legal aspect of blockchain technology and the governance implications. And at the same time, I'm also making blockchain-based art forms. And the idea is to use the art as a mean to illustrate the legal challenges which I'm analyzing within my actual academic research. And then I've been working a lot with various initiatives trying to design and identify new mechanisms for using blockchain technology as a new governance structure for communities and so forth.
Hello, good morning. So my name is Stephan-Eloise, and I am a researcher in cultural data analytics. I initially did my research on music recommendation algorithms and studied Spotify recommendation algorithms, and I moved to the question of ethics in technology, and especially from a post-colonial perspective, so including the Global South in all this reflection. I come both from communication sciences and philosophical background, and I also work in the digital startup world, currently at a platform for online education called Open Classroom, where I'm heading all their developments in Africa. So currently my focus has been a lot on Global South perspective on technology, and especially blockchain, which is also how I engage with Primavera, for example, in this conversation before the Clandestine talk start. Yeah, I think it's exciting to be invited for a clandestine conversation.
Domenic Perini here. Scalability architect and technical lead at Land Solutions is a company that focused primarily on functional programming and distributed data consistency model and scalability in parallel execution. I'm also co-founder and director at MOCTA, Museum of Contemporary Digital Art, and recently founded an organization called Everno, which is focusing on a novel approach for researching into customizable smart contracts. A brief info about my previous experiences. I think the one that is more relevant for this talk is that led a blockchain research and development team for a global credit card payment provider. And so I will discuss briefly about it later in the talk. I also had a fair amount of exposure to natural language processing research and development. In particular, I cooperated with police investigation in a consortium funded by the EU in partnership with New Scotland Yard Metropolitan Police and the Police of Madrid. That's it from me.
Okay, so I'm Beatriz. I am first and most an artist. I've been an entrepreneur for 20 years in the creative industries. And now, in the last few years, I've been working on a technology companies, basically a technology platform, an online platform where people all over the world can communicate only using drawings. So it's really a visual conversation platform in which you make a drawing on the platform and anyone around the world can reply with another drawing. And anyone else could add to that conversation. So it's very open. There are not any cultural boundaries. You don't know who the person is, what age they have. you don't know if sometimes if they're female or male, but you get to know a lot of who they are inside by just making this art together. So what brings me here is that in looking for how to make that community sustainable, we decided to go into blockchain and use crypto as a way of creating a crypto economy and an economy that is based on the values of this community. And that's what I've been working in the last few years. So all my experience as an entrepreneur, having companies and employees and, and working for clients in New York, I'm bringing that perspective into the other side of me, which is a social anarchist. And so I think crypto is a perfect place to explore these kinds of things.
Wonderful. So given all this incredible expertise and difference of background here, maybe we can start by trying to have this initial conversation about how do we each relate to this notion of crypto, whether that's like cryptography, whether that's like cryptocurrencies, crypto economy, and so forth, and like how do we see crypto actually affecting our life, and how do we each see us somehow contributing to this crypto ecosystem in the different facets of it. Would you like to start, Stephan?
Do I have that privilege?
Well, we got it.
Okay, so we're going like against the clockwise. Okay. So how is crypto affecting my life? That's a very good question. I think so. First, and I think I'm invited here also to be the sort of naive standpoint on blockchain, or maybe less of an insider, although I have been, around these communities for a while. So crypto for me, I mean, as a philosopher, I would always start with the etymology of crypto. And I think that it's interesting to look at crypto for that culture of like what is hidden, like crypto means literally in Greek what's hidden, what's not seen, what is being hidden from the real world. And from there we can like obviously go through a lot of aspects of the crypto communities today. Obviously from, I enjoyed what you mentioned, Beatriz, about the social anarchist, because crypto is indeed very much linked to that kind of political community of both crypto anarchists, social anarchists, and also cyberpunk communities. But before that, it was, if we look at the very long history of crypto and think about this word and how this word is becoming maybe a currency itself today, like by designing communities and like allowing some communities to affiliate themselves within a set of values that belong to that history, to that very long history. So I'm not an historian of crypto at all, but I think we can still mention that crypto was also very much linked to a science called hermeneutics, like the science of signs, that the Greek were, champion in, like in their cosmogony, every sign had a specific meaning. And so the hermeneutics was the science for interpreting this sign and like make the world readable and the world understandable. And then from there, early with the first religion gathering and structure, crypto became also a way to talk about those who were not part of the religion, but were hiding their religion to obey to the dominant religion. So there were a lot of like crypto Christianism, for example, which actually relate to how people were forced into converting themselves to Christianity. And so the Christians were mostly Jews who were, hiding their religion. Or the contrary also is possible. So I think it's very interesting to just, again, I don't want us to, dig into too deep in that history of crypto, but I think it's very important to keep in mind that crypto has this double affiliation or double roots. One is being the religious and spiritual root that relate to how you hide your face and how you hide something that you deeply believe in, and because of an oppression and because of a danger. And the second aspect, which is how crypto also became, and it's similar, but maybe with secularism it became more of a political. So in modern times, it became more of a political affiliation, thinking, okay, we need to, again, hide ourselves from the dominant world, from the oppressive structures, and maybe build a different distribution, a different, so crypto has keep in its core value that idea of both resisting to a dominant, hiding, so with a double agency kind of, attitude where you can speak a language instead of the truth, and it's allowed and it's even encouraged for your survival. And I think it's fascinating to look at this today when you think of the blockchain world and the blockchain communities, because I think we reached a point, and I know Prima, you've written a lot about that and you've talked a lot about that, where the blockchain community became such a dominant, like the blockchain being a new buzzword, and so crypto being, and I forgot to mention, but I think you will do that very well, Domenic, about the cryptographic, of course, community and the cryptographic practice, basically.
Absolutely.
Which also relate to that kind of faith plus resistance under wartime, basically. And so how, so crypto basically goes from hermeneutics of sign and a new way of looking at sign and how sign might express something and build language, faith, and how you hide your core values to survive, and social organization, how you resist to a dominant organization to maybe build something different. And so the blockchain world today is both rooted in that, I feel, or playing with these values, playing with this history, and at the same time being maybe a new dominant, the way how we saw the ICO craziness over the last couple of years. Also, clearly blockchain became also, and also if we think of Libra, for example, the Facebook cryptocurrency, I think it's very important that we raise all this question around the values that I just mentioned. So that's just my take on for an introduction. I don't know if Domenic.
No, thank you so much, and I think you mentioned some elements that are highly valuable in terms of the resistance and hiding. But what I would like to contribute from my end is that from a computational perspective, we are talking about transformation of information. So hiding gets performed in that way. So typically we are talking about cryptography, which is something that you mentioned briefly, which is a practice that effectively transforms, encodes an information. And if we look at how this developed over history, there's definitely a lot of military examples that boosted this type of practice. But we can see the first sign actually in ancient Egypt, around 1900 BC, where we see the first inscription carved that involve a transformation of a pictographic form into another pictographic form. And this apparently didn't have a military purpose. But it is true that later on, when this was brought along by Julius Caesar, about 100 BC, here we see some of the first use of military purpose cryptography. And apparently Julius Caesar was known to use a form of encryption to convey secret messages to his army generals in a remote location. And fast forwarding to more recent times, during World War II, we see the Enigma code that the Germans brought along, the Nazis. And this gave a boost in the sense that there was a machinery associated that would perform this encoding, this transformation. And yet, conversely, there was a machinery involved in decoding, which is what happened at Bletchley Park, led by Alan Turing. Mm-hmm. So I think recently this is taking even a further spin in what we mentioned, and we could see a resistance being put in place when it comes to the crypto space, the cryptocurrency space, and this is a resistance towards manipulation of capital from central banks over the world. And I think there is that element. So there is less the element of hiding. The element of hiding is present in the sense of providing a form of protection for the involved parties, but there's definitely an element of resistance.
Yeah, well, I will pick it up from there because from the social anarchist perspective, to me, what crypto does, like even the word crypto is hope, because and I never felt any hope with Obama, for instance. So, but here is really the potential of imagining and experimenting and figuring out new ways of organizing communities. And as much as the space has been co-opted by big banks and big companies like Facebook, or it's been co-opted, we still have these places where nobody's seen anything, nobody's really paying any attention. And so we can experiment as much as we want, and that's something that you can't do, let's say, in other aspects of society. It's very hard. Everything is already there's so many rules, and you just work within those rules. Here, there are no rules, and we're all figuring out based on our values. So in our case, I think one important aspect is when you talk about resistance and also decentralization is what is decentralization for people, right? Like for everyone is different. And so we see a lot of decentralization in the sense like, complete freedom from the individual. And so it goes more on the libertarian side. Or you can go all the way to freedom, which is what is interesting to me is how can we achieve complete freedom as an individual, and meaning especially those individuals on the margins, the ones that are always on the other side of the majority. How can we make sure that every individual can actually develop all their talents, everything, and fulfill their potential, at the same time that value that is created goes back into the community. So there is a sense that each person could add value, but that value will be part of a larger, more higher purpose for the community. And I think that's what, to me, crypto brings, especially because it's blockchain technology is perfect for small communities or for niche communities, to define the values of the communities, to create incentives, because you have a monetary currency linked to these communities, then you can imagine incentives that go along with that community, which is what we're doing. So in our case, data is a collaborative community. So you can make your drawings, but at any point in time, somebody will or could reply to that drawing, and at that moment, the drawing becomes a collaboration between the two people or the 50 people that are involved. So when you think about that, then we have to think about, well, what are the models for this community? In our case, because it's art, art for this community is priceless. So how you deal with an economic system for a community that is that think that with the value that they're bringing is priceless. The market cannot price it, or cannot. There are things that you can't put a price on it, like friendship and love and the experience that we're having here, right? Like it's just something that you cannot put a price to it. So how you think of a currency and a set of incentives that will incentivize the things that you want, the behaviors and the things that you want people to value or that people already value, and at the same time make it in a way that is sustainable. And also the work, which is interesting, in tandem with other communities as well. That may be completely different from yours, but you can sort of touch on each other and benefit from each other's communities, as opposed to this centralized thing that, where we live, where I'm a very normal person in society. I'm not a cypherpunk or anything like that, but when it comes to the question of, for instance, we had this debates in the States for the last few years about equal marriage. Of course, equal marriage, it's important, it's a civil right. It's nothing to do about love to me. It's a civil right, we should all have the same rights. Yes, if you ask me about whether it should be only heterosexual or it should be for all kinds of sexual preference and so on, yes, equal marriage. But the question really that I want is a third option, which is let's abolish marriage, right? Because the marriage of institution is so problematic in my view. So when you have a system in which you only have A to B, and you're always going to have people that think C or D, then it becomes really limiting. And I think what these systems could do is bring voices to all those people on the margin, whether they're the global south or whether they're the cypherpunks, but a place in which we all have a voice and that voice is heard and has an impact.
Thank you. I just want to say one sentence to follow this, because I think it tries to summarize a little bit of what your point is. Value is like love. You can give it to others, but you cannot transfer it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful
It's really
thing.
nice.
Yeah.
And just
Can you explain that?
well, so value, just like love, I can give love to people. I can produce love, but I cannot transfer love. If someone gives me love, I cannot give it to someone else, right? And the same thing with value. Value is something I can produce, is something I can give to people, but if I value something because you give me a present and I value it, I cherish it, if I transfer this to someone else, it's not the same value.
No.
So the whole concept of having this one objective market value that you assign to things, it's completely, or to services, everyone has its own subjectivity to what is valuable and what is not valuable.
Exactly.
And I can give you value, you can receive value, just like I can give you love and you can receive love, but it's not a commodity that I can transfer or I can trade on the market. There is no concept of trading love, right? and I think when you start creating this association, it's a beautiful analogy, I think, because we are constantly focusing on this concept of value as being like market value, and because the market says this is worth this, I can transfer that and the value is going to be the same, but it's not true. The value that we give to the same object is going to be very different depending on who we are and what we need. So that was just like a little attempt of, it's a beautiful sentence, I think. And now coming back to like the more philosophical or ideological side. So to me, I've been, since I'm very little, part of this like internet cypherpunks community and so forth, and I was like very interested before blockchain even about cryptography and steganography and all this stuff. And then I saw like with the blockchain, I really dived into this thing, and I could see like two different types of strong ideologies, at least. I mean, there is many, but those were the two main ones. And one is the crypto-libertarians, which basically see this technology as a way to somehow escape from governmental intervention and indeed potentially create their own system, which are self-governing, etc. But most of those systems, because they refuse governmental or institutional interventions, they always rely on this deep market-based approach to management, to governance, because if we don't have the institution governing anything, then the market will, right? And so the problem with this crypto-libertarian approach is that you always see, just like we have seen with markets when it's not protected by an institution, there is this tendency towards concentration and oligopolization, and eventually this decentralized market governance essentially becomes a plutocracy. And so the crypto-libertarian approach, which is strong in the blockchain space, to me is somehow talking about decentralization for the sake of decentralization without noticing that they're actually losing their own decentralization through the market concentration. And the other one, which actually I'm much closer ideological with, is the concept of the cypherpunks. And the cypherpunks actually like coming into the blockchain space is more because of this desire of privacy, financial privacy, because, you know, especially as more and more of transaction happens on the internet, then there is a need of creating a system so that credit card companies cannot know exactly what we buy all the time. And so this comes in the same way as the crypto-libertarian, it also comes with this desire of disintermediation, but it's based on a much more cohesive and cooperative approach. And what I really like about like the whole concept, and this is the basis with cryptography. So if value, sorry, I'm gonna make stupid analogy, but if value can be analogized with love, privacy, or like the privacy of communication is very analogy with sex, in the sense that
intimacy.
No, it's actually you need to protect both sides. Right? If I protect myself and you don't protect yourself, well, that's a problem. Oh. So the idea is that, and that's actually what the cypherpunks were trying to do, is like we need to democratize, like all the, we need to democratize the tools for actually acquiring privacy, and it needs to be a cohesive and cooperative effort because everyone needs to protect their privacy. If I communicate to you and I protect my, like I have a very secure system, but then you're using Gmail, well, I'm not protecting myself either because you're actually leaking my information. And so the cypherpunks approach is, as opposed to the crypto-libertarian, which is very individualistic and it's just like, I want my freedom, but it's a very individualistic type of freedom, whereas the cypherpunk freedom is a collective freedom. We all want to maintain our privacy, and therefore we're all gonna collaborate together in order to make sure that everyone is protected, right? And to this, I just want to add the last one, which is where my research is actually moving towards, which is, in some way, and it relates to what you were saying, Domenic, is that, so we've seen how things are moving from the initial crypto, which was like hiding and resistance, towards another type of crypto, which is more about proof, right? And like proving that something has not been manipulated or that something has happened. And interestingly, when we talk about blockchain today, it's also about transparency, right? Like the blockchain technology provides this proof and transparency that things have happened, and therefore greater accountability as to the actor interacting with this blockchain. And what I find very interesting is beyond this crypto-libertarian and cypherpunks approach, which is really anti-institutional in some way, is that actually more and more we can see how this technology can also benefit public or private institutions, which by adopting the technology can increase the confidence that they provide with regard to the way in which they operate, and this increased confidence is inherently due to the additional transparency and accountability that the technology provides. And so in some way it's a very interesting cycle in which we start with this desire of hiding from the institution, but then if the technology is used by the institution, it becomes a tool for greater transparency and accountability.
It's interesting. Can I add something to it? Because since we are in the Biennale of Venice, something similar is happening with the art world, right? Because the art market is so closed, so it's such a small amount of people who basically manage the whole market, and then of course lack of transparency is huge for this to be able to. For the whole thing to exist. So now that blockchain art and blockchain companies are getting into space, and there's this potential to make more transparency in the market, there's a big part of group that says that will never happen, because if there is transparency, there is no market, basically, our market. But this other part is saying, well, basically what you're saying is like by bringing more transparency, by bringing more regulation to their market, their market will expand, and people will have more trust on their market, right? And so it's interesting because there is this tension between the two, and I don't know the answer to what will be more positive. Some people think, let's say, that if banks adopt blockchain technology, then there is more transparency and more protection for users, and that will be good for everyone. But I don't see it that way because I don't trust institutions. So for me, it's like, okay, so it's just gonna be cheaper for them to do the same things that they do anyway, and more efficient. And so I think it's important to think about when we think on the positive effects of big institutions or the way the power structures work, co-opting these kinds of technologies that are built for resistance, that at some point is really, it might be more expansive, it might be a little step further. Right but it's not what it should or what it could be, and I always concentrate on what it could be, like what is the best scenario, and not just be pragmatic and say, well, this is the lesser evil.
So in all you've said, I mean, I heard a couple of things that really bring questions. First, I really enjoyed what you said, Beatriz, about, like some human values, you can't put a price on it, such as love or friendship, because that's exactly what Facebook's doing, and what like most platforms and most like contemporary technology are, their business model is based on the idea that you can put a price on emotions and on people's human values, And it's also very problematic because I'm not sure I totally agree with the fact that we could not put a price on human values. Like, let's say currency, for example, like, which is a very important topic for talking about crypto, because a currency is a stable value that, we talked about that already yesterday, but like a stable value that allow human exchanges to happen in some sort of like yeah, in a very rational world, we would say, like let's say
Neutral.
yeah, objective, or like I don't want to put like too many adjectives on that, but I just want to point out that human values can be depend on obviously the structures in which they are allowed to be distributed and built. And so coming back to what you said also, Prima, I think there's a potential paradox between the idea that cyberpunk will use crypto for providing a greater privacy, and so providing like a protective aspect to human assets and human necessities, such as freedom, such as privacy, etc. So there's a citizen sort of promise in crypto, and that we need to democratize these tools that will protect the privacy in order to be able to live together somewhat, and to fight a lack of transparency. So what I want to go to is like that articulation between values, transparency, and like communities. And I think it's interesting because crypto is at the core of that triangle. Crypto meaning like hashing, or meaning like how you actually create a language that is undecipherable, yes, like indéchiffrable in French, like that you cannot really read. So the signs are completely obscure and totally like non-transparent to be able to build a community that will have a greater transparency and articulated on values that we want to protect. But then the question is, like, and I don't want to move too fast to the one aspect that I'm sure we will have to go through, which is the governance of the community.
Inevitably.
Like, yes, inevitably. But it's like, it's very important. But could we like just maybe have a deeper? I mean, I would like to hear all of you on that question of like transparency and signs, like which is at the core of crypto. Because to me, coming from like a philosophical background, especially in aesthetics, signs are never transparent. That's the basis of human interactions, and it's at the basis of art also. Art being a certain regime for a sign. Like we have, it's not the same to use sign when you sign a contract for submitting to a certain cooperation or trade or an exchange, and like having to look at a painting or hearing something such as a music piece, and like hearing and trying to understand what's happening there and what's going on there. So without getting too deep in the metaphysics of what art is, what the sign provides or sign for, I think the interesting thing about crypto is that it's precisely articulate a very, like we have an obvious conversation on like political implication of crypto, such as cyberpunk, social anarchist, or on the contrary, libertarian, and like serving the centralization movement. We have a conversation on like what's crypto as hashing and like creating language, and like and in that conversation there's also a question around what's the status of code, and like computational code, and what it means to deal with code. And like, since also one of the problem here is that is like what kind of blockchain language are we talking about? Like who can actually code that, and who can actually decode that, and like be part of that conversation, and like to be able to be a miner in a community. And then we have like the governance and the community design conversation about like what's Like what are the values itself, and like how do we make sure? And I know, like, I'm very admirative of what you're doing with data, because data,
Dada.
like data, because it's a total like non-logocentric community. I mean, it's brilliant. It's like you ask someone to not use signs such as natural language to
Symbolic representation.
or symbolic representation. I mean, it's still symbolic because it's drawing, but it's non-logocentric because anybody can create. Like the sign itself doesn't obey to a framework for meaning. You can draw an apple. You can draw something completely abstract. You are still welcome in that community, and you are still part of that exchange community and platform. So I think that would be my question for all of you guys. It's like, how do you see crypto being really like, do you feel that crypto is both an experience of values, science, and aesthetic and politics? It's a big question. I'm sorry.
May I just take the opportunity to
Sure.
refine a little bit the question, because I think this is we all have like something that we're actually working on those questions. In the sense of, because I think maybe it will be useful if every one of us introduce also the extent to which we are using crypto as a way of enacting, catalyzing, supporting specific artistic practices or helping artists actually do their job. So maybe we can present very shortly like what is our project on that level, and then we can answer the question.
Absolutely. So essentially, before I do that, I would like to respond to some of the elements that came up in this conversation so far. And I wanted to touch on the subject of hashing. I wanted to touch on the subject of transparency and protection. And I wanted to also bring to the table what I'm also feeling enthusiastic about, like many in the blockchain and crypto space. However, I think there's still a very long journey to go in order to provide a transparency and protection and some other values into the table. And touching on the subject of hashing, just to clarify for everyone, hashing is a form of converting information, and is a one-way conversion, as you briefly touched on the subject. So there's no way to go back from hashed information. So it's a destructive approach. So as opposed to traditional cryptography, from which you reverse if you know the cipher, if you know how to go back. So on the subject of transparency, I think explanation is key, and proof that, for example, an actor owns an asset, or proof that an exchange of an asset has happened into history. And I want to bring on this subject to the table also the immutability of this data structure called blockchain. So effectively, there's no possibility to go and alter the history, which gives a degree of transparency and verification. And however, what I'm saying is that there's a long way to go in terms of some other values that have received a response in the blockchain and crypto space, in particular self-determination and the intention to break free from models that are imposed upon us by, say, large corporations, governments, large organizations towards which we feel sometimes impotent, and we don't. We have a limited participation in that. We see corruption happening, and so therefore there's the desire to explore new forms of cooperation or collaboration. And I would like to say that although the blockchain movement has brought on an interesting response in this sense when it comes to decentralization, I think there's still a long way to go, because exactly for what you briefly touched on, Primavera, which is that this decentralized form of governance typically get associated with monetary power anyway, so they get somehow corrupted. So I think what I'm bringing to the table in terms of my effort is a way to cooperatively define artifacts that perform transformation that are recorded in an immutable history, and through those I would like to exercise governance, a governance that is built by humans, but perhaps where humans don't have a dominant influence in the sense of democratic participation, such as casting a vote. So I'm inclined to embrace a reality where there's an automation that drives consensus and governance, which I'm totally prepared to hear your objections about. But yeah, this is where I'm heading. And in terms of Everknow and Mokta, which is my startup initiatives, is something that targets at first very creative minds, because I have also the impression that engineers that I typically happen to work with have the tendency of following practices that come from a manual or a template, something that has been proven to be working. While instead I want to break free from this and explore new ways of doing things. Similarly goes for the academic approach, which is introducing elements of innovation, but in my opinion this could be accelerated dramatically if we were considering a form of artifact that is not a scientific paper, but is an artifact that has the potential of performing transformation and has been recorded in an immutable history, and therefore it is protected by itself. Because typically people release in the academic space, they release a paper just to claim that they were the first reaching a conclusion and coming up with an invention, and yet there's a lot of effort going to coming up with a paper and producing a paper, and I think this could be optimized significantly. Yeah, this is where I'm coming from.
I really love how you are looking at it, and would love to use whatever you come up with and experiment with, because it's liberating, right? Like what you're doing is creating something that other people can come use and liberate their creativity and experimentation, which is what the three of us were doing in our own way. So I have so much to say. I don't know. So
we have time.
Yeah.
Pick a subject. Governance.
No, yeah,
Governance is a hot topic.
That's a difficult one.
It would be useful that you present a little bit what Dada.
About that.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to figure out what's the angle of how you present it. But all right, so
the inclusion, perhaps, and the diversity. Because I think it's amazing what you do at Dada.
Thank you. But I want to touch on what you were saying, Stefan, in your question. So we we have a community that, what we said before, is based on values that you can't really put a price on them. And so probably the best example will be Wikipedia, right, that everybody knows. You have a very small set of people doing a lot of work for the greater good without any payment. You know, they're not doing this for payment. So we have a community that is similar. They're spending hours and hours. These are thousands of people that are spending hours and hours of their time putting, creating work on the platform. You don't upload anything. You create it with our tools, which are, by the way, very, very simple. And I think they're simpler than Microsoft Paint. So in an era where you have all these amazing applications for drawings and these like brushes and things, and you can create these amazing things with digital art, we just give this very simple, rudimentary tool because it was important for us, for people to concentrate on the communication and not on what you could do as an artist. So anyone, even if you're not an artist, could communicate through this tool, right? So what that made was a community that the first value is to communicate with each other, to connect with each other, and because it's through drawings, it becomes this authentic process. Like, you know, you're in social media, you can invent your own persona, right? Mm-hmm. But when you're drawing, you can't, because what you were saying before, Stefan, is if when you do art, it's not only just because it's symbolic, or it's also that I may be, depressed at that moment, and that's going to come out. So when you see with time, and you get to know people because of just a drawing. Remember, we don't know anything else. We don't know their ages, where they live necessarily, or the social economic conditions. But you know by their drawings that they may get maybe a little bit depressed, and then how they get out of the depression, or how they fall in love with someone, and then how the break happens. You see that over the years. And there's a connection that happens that is so profound just by witnessing that. But it becomes even more profound when you're part of it. So if you are drawing and you're depressed, let's say, and you're making this drawing that is obviously, you're getting that out of your system, and there's somebody that comes and spend hours making a drawing that replies to yours, just like bringing you up, or just like listening to you, or that creates a very strong connection. So it's almost like talking through poetry. You connect in a very deep level. And so what do you do with that when you have a community that is like that, right? And how you make it sustainable, because that's, to me, the biggest question. And so do you use a donation model like Wikipedia? I happen to be very against anything that is like mecenas or patrons or donation, because I believe that artists bring a lot of value, and I don't like the fact of that value being something like, yes, we have to support artists because, you know, let's them do their thing. No, it's a lot of value, and it should be valued as such, right? So how do we create a system in which it's not dependent on other people's goodwill, but that is actually the value that it is, it's been recognized? At the same time, how do we create a system in which that money doesn't corrupt the intrinsic motivations of people of doing what they're already doing for free? And so, going back to Wikipedia, it's known that people do it for self-development, for a sense of community, for a sense of higher purpose, of keeping the knowledge of the world uncorrupted. And in that it's the same. It's like you might be an amateur person, and then after a year you're actually making great drawings, because anyone could learn to draw. And you're learning from others. So self-development, a sense of connection with a community, a sense of higher purpose. Like we're all here, we're all resisting together, right? And we're all doing this little thing together. And also the simple joy of creating. So.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly, or was it my impression, that the blockchain helped you achieving this?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, this is what we're figuring out, but I think it's only possible because of blockchain that I can see this solution. Otherwise, it would be really hard. So the main thing is that when you have intrinsic, like the easiest way to stop somebody from drawing, let's say, or playing music for love, is by paying them, and then you stop paying them. And all of a sudden, the mind changes from something that you used to do for free and for pleasure, now it's not worth your time anymore. And because your mind changes from social norms to market norms. And so when that happens, and this is like very well researched, right? Intrinsic motivations, at the moment that you change and replace those intrinsic motivations for extrinsic motivations, like recognition or money, or you win a contest or something like that, the intrinsic motivations diminished or even disappear completely. So all of a sudden your mind goes to, okay, so I can make more money doing this. That's my mind now. Now I'm becoming more competitive. I'm becoming more centered on I can live out of this, make money, blah, 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 right? So this is very important, because at the moment that we start selling digital drawings using blockchain, which is possible now, the mentality of this community is going to change. Being a collaborative community that is doing this for love, basically, of yourself or for others, that will completely corrupt the magic that happens, right? So, so the question for us is how you create a system that maintains the intrinsic motivations of each individual, which one big one is the collaboration, and the second is how you maintain the social norms so that the minds don't go into being competitive, or the sense of hoarding, or the sense of speculation and things like that.
Absolutely. And preserving those values while you get on into a model that becomes economically self-sustainable.
Right.
That's
so how you
and then difficulty.
And then we go back to what you were saying, Stefan, about currency, right? Because we tend to think about currency just in terms of money, but it have to be some kind of value system. It doesn't have to be money. I would love it not for us not to be a token that equals money, but something else. And could we come up with art as a currency, for instance, and within this community?
Absolutely.
And so then you have to think about what are the functions of money, right? And there are three. There is what you were referring to, Stefan, the exchange of value. Of course, it makes it much easier than bartering, right? Because we can transfer value in a much efficient way. There is the store of value, and there is as a unit of measure, be able to measure how we value things. Like this glass is $1.
You touched on a very important subject, which I like a lot, and which is the fungible aspect of how we are used to store value. What you briefly touched on is a non-fungible way of storing wealth, which is, for example, a work of art itself. You could trade a work of art on the market, and not for money, which is a fungible, or a cryptocurrency, which is a fungible type of wealth storage. You could store it in another form. Let's be open to this perspective, because I think it's very exciting, and it could be a game changer.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
There's a flip side to what you're saying. I mean, I totally support this idea that we have to literally look at other valuing process, and like how we might maintain a plurality of value and a diversity of valuing process within the community, because otherwise we might end up with a credit score like in China, or you know, like. But let me just bring something on the table, which also goes back to what I was saying earlier at the beginning of the conversation, and I'd love to hear your Primavera on this, but there's one space where values and human values became the currency. It's religion, you know. Like in religion, you don't have money for valuing people. You have, you know, norms that relate to spirituality. So like you obey to a certain like set of values that is, you know, kindness, honesty, transparency, etc., etc. So what about, you know, like how can we explore and how can we make sure? I mean, I'm not anti-religious spontaneously, I would say, you know, like I'm personally very much of a believer in terms of like spirituality, but I'm not a religious person, and I always had that conviction that, you know, like also maybe being French, that you know, like society, the modern society start where religion can be like limited, you know. So my question is like, how do we, and it really like also is at the core of crypto, as you know, like the language, the hashing, the organization, the technology, etc. But really, like, how do we make sure that blockchain is not a new religion?
Yeah, well,
is it possible?
It's already sort of a new religion.
I mean, I think it's actually it's multiple religions, and because there is multiple blockchains, and every blockchain is its own religion, and it's actually it's very interesting. But like there is this strange, like since maybe like 6 months, 1 year, there is this strange thing of like everyone starting to talk about those like, you know, those dogmas. Like blockchain technology has become a dogma. It's like it's a crypto religions, and we have like the Bitcoin maximalist, which is an actual religion, which believes in the thing that the code is the law, and no one has any possibility, no one should ever tamper with the protocol. And then we have like the, you know, the Ethereum, much more flexible ideas of, well, we want to focus on the distributed consensus, and it's actually okay, potentially, to change the protocol to the extent that the community consensually believe that this is better either for the Ethereum community or for the world as a whole. But basically, like we start seeing, like, you know, even those schisms. So when we notice like there is the Ethereum crypto religion, but then at some point some people decide to fork and some people decide not to fork, and you have a schism. You literally have a schism in the crypto religion of Ethereum, and you have now two sub-religions, just like we have like Christianism and all the subsets. And then we also have, like, if you think about the vocabulary, you have like oracles, right? Like in order to interact with the real world, the blockchain needs oracles that are essentially like creating like the interface. And then like if you look, or like people sometimes when they think about, so what should we do? Like, should we change that code? Should we not? You know? And they're like, well, what would Satoshi Nakamoto do, you know? And you have people like, you know, Nick Zab or whatever talking in the name of, you know, like kind of like the Messiah or the prophecy and stuff like that. It's very interesting, and my research has been analyzing for a lot like the political dynamics, the power dynamics that exist within the different actors or the different blockchain communities. And recently I had this fascinating discussion with a theologist, and I realized how it's in some way it's much easier to analyze and to look at the power dynamics within blockchain communities from a theological standpoint rather than a political standpoint, because politics is really, I mean, it's becoming blurry over time, but politics is really much about like, let's find those compromise between people. That's theoretically right, but now it becomes like in the blockchain space there is no possibility of compromise. It's not a desire. It's not about we want to live together and let's find ways in which we can coexist. It's more about this is our dogma. You have to follow our dogma. And it's about creating incentives for people to join that religion, because then the network becomes more powerful. And it's actually like, in terms of analyzing the power dynamics, of course it's not enough. Like you also need like the social and political standpoint to understand some things. But it's fascinating how the theological prism is actually providing such interesting insights in the way in which those different communities are evolving. And interestingly, like, so you have like the crypto libertarian type things, you have like the code is law things, and with our little group we're trying to develop the crypto humanism ideology as a way of actually, many people are actually seeking those different like
you say crypto-humanism?
Crypto-humanism. Putting human back at the center. It's not about the technology is just like a tool to help people emancipate themselves, to help like the governance should actually be, and I'm sure you have something to say about that, but the governance should actually be about the people, like how do people organize themselves. And if we look at these like crypto self-enforcing mechanism, then it's always going to be technology first, and people that are just like the consequence of how the technology operates, as opposed to the opposite, right? And that's where, like, again, the question of governance becomes absolutely fundamental in all of the systems, because even the systems that pretend to be trustless, of course, are not trustless. And then you just have like underneath, and that's where, like, whether it's like a theological thing or a political thing or whatever, you have all those actors that are exerting influence over each other in a very polycentric type of governance system. So you don't have one actor that can unilaterally impose the will. You don't have like the one sovereign, but you have all those different sub-network of actors that have, like, whether it's the miners, whether it's the validator, whether it's the cryptocurrency exchange, whether it's the charismatic leader, or whether it's like the people that have the louder voice on the social media, which are all interacting with each other, trying to influence in order to actually further their own interest. Right? And to me, like, if we want to think about a proper governance for the system so that the technological guarantees of transparency, decentralization, accountability, and the proof that the blockchain provides cannot actually be achieved without understanding the governance and without making sure that the governance is actually putting the human at the center of the system. I'm happy to hear your disagreement, Domenic.
No, there's a couple of things that I wanted to discuss in relation to what we brought up. So essentially, I sensed originally there was interesting into how we define value, and I came to the conclusion some time ago on even when we consider the value of a work of art, what is it that we consider valuable about it? Is it the manifestation itself that we see, the tangible evidence of how we perceive a work of art? Is it the transcendence I heard also, or is it perhaps the idea that's behind it, the idea that's behind the manifestation? So is it something is this what we are actually trading? And the manifestation is just a reminder of that idea. So this I want to bring on as a question.
It's probably all of it, and the significance and the emotional transcendence. It's all of it, and it will be different from
And
each
that's
art.
why the value is inherently subjective.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
different people will assign value to different facets of the same art piece.
Yeah. And the same person may assign different values to different pieces of art, or different values of the same piece of art in different moments of their life.
Yeah. I mean, the whole concept, and I think it goes back to the discussion we had before, is like the concept of having this objective value is just a construction of the current monopoly of the market system. Right? We have like the market value has become the objectivity, and when we're thinking what is the value of an art piece, that doesn't, like, when you ask like what is the value, you don't think about the market value, but yet this is what happens. Like when you say this is valued at like $2 million and this is like $200, right? But what is the actual value that we feel? It's not a market value. When you see an art piece and you're experiencing and you get this transcendence feeling, it's not a market value, and you cannot put a price on it. It becomes priced by the market when it becomes a commodity. But the experience of art is not a commodity. And that's where you inherently can only talk about subjective value when you experience the art. And the only way you can talk about objective value, which I think even the fact of talking about objective value in the market system is wrong, because it assumes that it's just this homogenization of the values of many different people, right? So today, the value that is assigned to a market, to an art piece by the market, is essentially the extrinsic value of it, which is the speculative or investor-based mechanism of assigning value to it. But we're not talking about the intrinsic value of the artwork, and the intrinsic value is
subjective.
what it emanates from the art and what is creating this relationship with the viewer, and it's inherently subjective.
Okay.
And the problem is that we don't have tools today to express this value in any other way than the market value. And so because that's the only tool we have, we kind of fall into that. Mm-hmm. But to me, probably the intrinsic value is even hardly quantitative. It's more like a qualitative value. And we cannot really use the same metrics as we use with the market for this.
And let me just add one thing that I think is important on the question of value. The market doesn't assign value. The market assigns a price. And price is not the same as value. And that is a very important, crucial, I think.
Well, it's a market value. That's
but
what we call market
it's really
value.
Price, right? It's a number.
Sure.
And so price, because you may be a collector and you're buying something for its significance, and they have all these intrinsic values for that person, but he's paying a price. And that's a very important thing, because it's very limiting when it comes to things that are intangible and subjective.
I will say that the market puts a focus and tries to protect also intellectual property, which conversely is more linked to ideas, or is something more of a software thing rather than a physical manifestation. So in that sense, there's a value traded that is also related to these ideas. And I think this is fascinating in the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, in the sense that there's a chance to provide better protection, because for instance, physical work of art also deteriorate over time, while, for example, the idea that was behind the creation of a work of art doesn't deteriorate, provided we have a way of encoding it. And this is what's fascinating about digital art, because it can be replicated a number of times in an exact form, right? And then we can associate several manifestations alongside it.
Can I take?
Sure.
I strongly disagree with the idea.
I love when we disagree.
We need more disagreement.
There's plenty of disagreements that
come out.
No, but I disagree with the idea that there would be something such as a pure realm for emotion and artistic experiences, and that experience is not a commodity, as you said, Prima. I think over the last 3 centuries, we've seen that experience and taste and education became a commodity, and this single idea is even like necessary for having something such as citizenship. So let me explain. Like, so I worked on like taste and taste maker machine and recommendation algorithm, and like that's how I got there. And I realized, like there's something such as pop music, there's something such as cultural industries, and I would say that maybe the Biennale here is not so far from that pop art, like industry, and even like, you look at just pop art and like, so in other ways, emotions are always like tied to a market value. And it doesn't mean that there's no, like, that they are impure or that they are degrading or that they are not, that there's not a poetry aspect in that. Like, you can have, like, that's the point about folk cultures and pop culture, like popular culture, which is basically, something where we don't value them as, something that is like high standard, but never, and they probably like, and they belong, and they are like, they exist thanks to an industrial system, like they exist because they have access to like media, they have like, they are even like crafted, either in a very like popular practice. And nevertheless, like it still brings some experience and emotion in that, So, so taste, for example, taste became a commodity a long time ago. Taste became a commodity the moment we said art can be reproduced and culture can be distributed, and that was necessary for thinking that people can actually emancipate themselves thanks to culture, thanks to books, thanks to records, thanks to school, So in other terms, like the industrialization of our mind and the industrialization of our experiences and aesthetic experiences also supported the possibility for people to be citizens and to be like educated and like to share common language. So just from that standpoint, and I know, like, I don't think I don't think we can, or it's a very utopian way to look at blockchain or technology in general, such as something that where we can sort of like protect it from any market sort of like mixed, because the possibility for people to just talk and like share expression, and I really agree that what your question was probably very right. Like we can answer to both, saying what's value in art? Is that the manifestation, or like are we buying basically the commodity, and are we enjoying like the physical commodity or the physical experience of like this painting, this specific show, this specific experience, or are we enjoying the ideas behind the manifestation? And I think that precisely art has always been a game, a play, rather than a game, a play within these two aspects and many other aspects. So I think, it's inevitable that we will have, if we talk about blockchain in art and like how blockchain can support different levels of distributing and designing experience. I don't think we can just see it as a separate aspect from a market. It is already a market, like the.
Well, I disagree on that, but I think what you're saying, and I should, because otherwise you just fall into repeating the same frameworks that already exist. But I think what you're saying is very interesting, because when you're saying, I take two things. One is, yes, we need a symbolic agreement or otherwise we go crazy as a society, right? Like we need to have boundaries, things that we agree on the symbolic sense, so that we all know what's right, what's wrong, what's right within our system. But the other side of this industrialization of taste or knowledge is that it's another way of saying standardization, and it's another way of saying indoctrination, right? And so to me, what we need to do is precisely the opposite. Is let's go to a more diverse, more unique. Let's go for the uniqueness of each of us. And I think that's what social anarchism is not in the sort of quote unquote deprivation that became the libertarianism in the US, but the actual social anarchism is how we organize a society in which, based on certain symbolic and cultural agreements, each individual can be the best that it can be in its own unique way. And I think that's what blockchain may...
Yeah, and I think I completely 100% agree with this, and I partially disagree with what you were saying, Stefan, because I think the thing that, of course, blockchain is being commoditized. That's like for sure. It's like it has fallen into like the capitalist hands, and it's actually being used as a speculative tool. But that it's not because you see this happening that's the only way it can go. And there is actually a lot of other stuff happening at the same time underneath or in other realms. And I think it's actually very important to see the problems of the speculation and like the marketization of this technology. But on the other hand, there is really nothing wrong about it. Like it's just happened, and it's not like no one can avoid this from happening. But to me, it's actually extremely important not to just fall into this and say, oh, because it is like this, that's the only way it can be, because there is actually interesting experimentation. And to me, like the big problem that, not the problem, but the big deception at the moment of the blockchain is that people are actually seeing this technology, and while initially there was those visions of disruption, of like, you know, everyone can create their own currency, which is cool, but yet everyone is creating the same type of currency. We are all replicating the same old model and just actually giving tools for the traditional mechanism of hyper-capitalism to flourish on top of that. But at the same time, like the possibility of experimentation, like monetary experimentation, is fascinating. And it's kind of unfortunate that there is not more of it. And to me, actually, like the possibility that everyone creates their own value, right? Like if I'm an artist, I can produce value, and whatever, this value is subjective. It cannot be assessed in a purely objective way. And the fact, if I could just, like where, today basically we have this problem that money is created where debt is created. We have a debt-based currency.
Absolutely.
Instead of having a much more constructive mechanism where money is created where value is created, right? Which is, if I'm creating value, I'm also creating my own token, my own cryptocurrency, or however you want to call it. And this is like a bootstrapping mechanism. And whoever sees values in my services, in my products, in whatever like the art I produce, then they will see value in those tokens, because those tokens are a representation, a direct representation of the value that I produce, because it's a way of accessing this value. Now, the interesting part is, of course, if it's just, you just need my token to buy my services, it's more almost a barter system. But if we expand into a much broader ecosystem, in which many actors which produce value produce their own tokens, and then the value of this token is based both on how many people, or how much I want that, but also how many people around me want that. So if I'm surrounded by people that really care about accessing your product, your beautiful platform on data, then maybe I don't care so much about it, but all my friends do. So I know that those tokens will also be accepted by my friends. And we create this thing, so this subjective economy mechanism, which to me is something that has yet to be explored. And to me, this is one of the most fascinating potential of this technology. And the beauty of it is that we still have a mechanism. It's still like some kind of evaluation, somehow quantification of things, but it's inherently to me, to my actual value that I get from getting the service, but also to my values, to my value system. And in the sense that even if I don't need your product, but I love data, I don't really need it because we're friends and I'm sure you're going to give me extra access to the platform if there is any premium. But at the same time, I love what you're doing and I love what people are doing, which are trying to like do climate change or helping something, you know? And so I'm also going to accept their tokens. Even if I don't need them because I don't actually want to purchase the service, I want to provide additional liquidity to those tokens, and so I'm going to accept them. And so every individual becomes an actor in the global economy by choosing what kind of token it accepts and what kind of token it rejects. And for instance, I might say, I'm going to reject every single token from like whatever, the oil industry and things like this, you know? And so I actually, all of a sudden, what I do, of course, in my small system, it matters. Like if I'm engaging into accepting and rejecting tokens, I'm also, to some extent, globally promoting specific products or services and boycotting others, even though I'm not preventing anything from happening, but I'm reducing the liquidity of those tokens. And to me, the interesting thing is, today, instead of having, like, if I want to start anything, I need to go and get a loan from a bank and I create debt, as opposed to, well, if I expect I'm going to create value, I just issue those tokens. And whoever believes in my existing and future value, they will actually accept those tokens. And then you create like those local economies that can expand at the global level.
Beautiful.
So I want to respond to that because it seemed like I think we all agree in the end. When I said I did agree, is just like let's try to have a non-Eurocentric or Western-centric look at values and experience. Because when we say experience should not be a commodity, I think it's very hypocrite. Like because it is, like in the philosophy of what an individual is and what a subject is, it is necessarily a commodity. And what I want to say now is like we've been talking a lot about values and there's like some sort of like obsession with values. What if we can imagine maybe some cultures and some spaces and platforms where value is not even a discussion, it's not even a concept, it's not even like part of the vocabulary. And like what you're saying is I enjoy this. I had this thought or this vision while you were talking where we could imagine that tokenization could become a sort of like new writing, like
what?
writing,
Like
a writing process, like tokenizing, but it's tokenizing is like creating a defining a value that becomes a sort of like a common ground for people to actually interact and like exchange, and whatever the token is and whatever the value is decided to be, it becomes a writing process. It's but I want to, and from there I was like, because a lot of my work was about music and hearing. And I also looked at, global South perspective. And by doing that, and again, like when I said I really admire what you're doing with data, it's because data is a non-logocentric community. And I think that it's a very important take to have on technology, is that is it possible to have a non-logocentric approach to technology? Anyway, what I was interested in thinking like of tokenization as a new writing process is, what about communities and cultures where writing is not even a possibility? Like there are a lot of what we call primitive societies where writing is not and valuing is not part of the social norms. It's not what makes people live together. It's not what makes people interact with each other and what interact with nature.
But you're talking about economic value, right?
I'm talking about values in general. Like,
but how do you have most people? I don't
think
have values. Like not necessarily every community has a economic value mechanism, but I think everybody has values.
Yeah.
Well,
social norms,
No,
right? Like
well-
some-
Or even
some
like
kind.
ideological values.
I
like
think we need to
justice.
define that, because I think values such as a sort of like minimum standard or not or maximum, but anyway something that
So what
gather
would be
people
a-
together.
a- an example of a community that wouldn't have values?
Well, like for example, if you take there's a Shona community in Zimbabwe, okay? So the Shona community, we might call that value, but they will never use the term value to look to or explain what they're doing, what brings them together, okay? So what I'm saying is that this obsession with value might also say something about how we want to shape community.
Oh, interesting.
And so the Shona community, for example, from what I know, and I'm not an anthropologist, but I think we inevitably have to be anthropologists if we are looking at technologies that are per se global, and that brings like a potential global impact. So we always need to look at the values behind the technology, but also not the values but decentering the value and like how we even think of what the value is. So Shona community in music, for example, there's a musicologist I worked with at NYU called Martin Scherzinger. Sorry for the name dropping, but I really want to mention his work because it brought a very important perspective. It's been like a music in my in my head all along my research and my career in the very different aspect of my research and professional activity and practice. Basically showed that by, there's an instrument called the lamellaphone, which is like a thumb piano. So we call it mbira. And so in musicology, we think that, music can be defined with harmony or melody, basically. So there's like different parameters to analyze music as a language or music as a cultural production and a manifestation of something. And we very often look at African music as being polyrhythmic. So it's in other ways there's many other paradigm or parameters than just harmony and melody. There's like rhythm and timbre and but anyway, you have like different facets to look at music information. And the way we looked at African music, because it was so hard to shape in our writing of music, in our understanding and analysis of music, was it's polyrhythmic, it's non-harmonic, because it's like so basically we're like different writing or different understanding of music, and so it put it aside and it put it in the margins, and we'll get back to that idea that we're always sort of like fighting or considering a possibility for margins to exist in what we're doing. So he showed that musicologists show that where we believe that, so in the Shona music, it's not harmonic, because the lamellaphone, the mbira, is a we call it tempered music. So there's no stable notes, as opposed to the Western music where notes are tempered. So Bach invented that, so the Baroque music brought that, and so he shows that the way musicians in Shona tribe would play the lamellaphone, the mbira, was we would see it as highly polyrhythmic with the existence of what we call ghost rhythm. Ghost rhythm is like a very important concept in groove, for example. Like it has this idea that the body at some point will, create something that makes the music groove, but we can't actually put a name on it, we can't actually identify it, and we can't actually write it down, in a score, for example. So he says, Martin showed that, the mbira music is not defined or is not determined by rhythm and the necessity to actually make some sort of like groove rhythm, but by the necessity to actually make some specific sound appear in the performance. So harmonics, for example, you're all familiar with harmonics in music, right? So harmonics are the notes that that sounds when two notes sound. It's like it relates to the physics of sound, basically. When you hear one sound, you can hear many different notes in it because the sound frequencies will sort of like collide and create another frequencies. So harmonics are very important also in analyzing music because it's this kind of like crypto or unseen or unheardable or hardly hearable sound within the sound, okay? And so what Martin showed is that the Shona tribe, when they play mbira, according to the social convention or the social context for which they are playing music, so for example, if, let's say they're playing for a wedding or they're playing for a death, or they're playing to celebrate, you know, like love, or they're still playing to celebrate war, they will have to play, the rhythm will be determined by the necessity of the sounding of specific notes. So the harmonics, you know, because of the physics of sound, if you play very rapidly, you will have some sharp notes sounding. If you play more slowly, you will have like more like grave and like deep notes hearing. And so they don't play like the rhythm because they want to perform a certain rhythm, but they play a certain rhythm to make sound that are unheard sounds, to make note sounds that would be otherwise unhearable. So in that sense, the way we look at like African music and like African culture is completely determined by our Western-centric approach and understanding of musicology and music science, you know. And I think we have to apply the same consideration about values in, you know, technological systems and values in
general.
In general, yeah, absolutely. We are this, and that's why I mentioned earlier, we are obsessed with values because we live, you know, because we carry along a whole civilization, and like that is not so long in the end because it's just a couple of centuries. Yeah. What is a couple of centuries to the extent of
I don't think I
the
have
Earth?
the cultural depth to cover that subject, but my best guess is that value is derived from original expectation that we build in society. For example, that we start by getting along and not kill each other, or expect that people respect that you own something, right? This is how we came along, this notion of value. Of course, this has been pushed further down the line. I mean, has been expanded a lot in our society, and now is. You touched on a very interesting subject, Primavera, and on debt, or another economic system that is not based on debt. And I also, as a best guess, is I came across this notion of debt as a way of boosting an economic model, as boosting the motivation, because it ignites fear in individuals. So the fear of not being able to repay this.
It also enslave them into the capitalist machine.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that works as a motivation for people to get along and produce something.
But yet to produce only within that framework in which they have been enslaved.
Yeah. That's right.
It's a boost, but it's a very monodirectional boost.
Not only, but
you have to pay back your debt, and the only way to pay back your debt is to acquire the resources in the same exact system. Mm-hmm. So because I indebt myself with euros, then I need to collect euros in order to bring them back. And the problem is that it's extractive. Like the only way I can get euros is I need to take them from someone else or ask the bank to generate new debt, right? Yeah. But it's inherently extractive, as opposed to a value-based economy in which it's productive. I don't need to extract value from someone else to create my own tokens, because I create value, I can create tokens.
The suggestion is very interesting, and you are talking about a value associated to creation, effectively. And I'm totally open to that perspective. However, someone might question whether it's got a sustainability in itself, this model, in the way that we perceive sustainability nowadays. Because I'm also prepared to argue that nowadays sustainability is non-sustainable because
today level of sustainability is completely unsustainable. For sure.
Exactly. So it's a good approach to explore, and it might not associate a motivational boost as the debt system is carrying along, but it might be a healthy way of moving forward.
I think it's you're taking the debt based is like the stick, right? Like you are afraid, you need to survive, you need to pay back your debt, and therefore you need to work within that particular framework. So because you have a stick on your back, as opposed to the creation based, the value based creation of token or money, which is the carrot. It's like, well, if you produce, there is still an incentive to produce, because if you produce, your token becomes more valuable, and then you have more capacity to exist in this system, you have more liquidity. So it's, of course, the debt base has a very strong influence because it has a big stick on your back, but it doesn't mean that you cannot have a much more beautiful actually and productive system, which just as much incentive, except that the incentive is a positive incentive instead of a negative incentive.
Yeah, this is what the majority of people, I guess, will question, whether the motivational factor is strong enough. Because it's a fascinating motivational factor to exercise your creativity and wake up in the morning and thinking.
Well, it happens already, as we discussed. Like people all over the world are making art or research or doing tons of things and put a lot of work for no money, just because there are other motivations.
I think the challenge is I think for sure, like a positive incentive mechanism definitely works. The danger, and that's the big preoccupation, is how do you make sure that it doesn't get exploited or corrupted by the capitalist debt-based model, right? And I want to say something, because I want to build back on what you were saying about like different types of values and Africa in especially, because the big problem here is basically that we live in the Western world, at least we live in a very strong capitalist framework, and as we were discussing yesterday,
which is embedded in our culture, by the way.
Yeah, it's embedded in our culture.
It's difficult to get out of it.
I completely agree. And also because of us all living into this framework, then the dominant strategy is playing the role of the game, becoming a capitalist ourselves, and everyone that tries to cooperate gets crushed because I'm doing this because I like doing it, and then they come and they appropriate it, and then I become a loser, and therefore I need to play the game as well, otherwise I get in debt. There is this very beautiful philosophy. I wouldn't call it value, but I call it philosophy, because it is a philosophy, which is the Ubuntu philosophy. It's one of the most beautiful things that I have heard, so I will share it, because actually it relates a lot with the question of resilience of this alternative economic or political system. And basically the Ubuntu, it's also geographic, right? So in those communities that abide by the Ubuntu philosophy, everything is about fractals. Like the geographical core is fractals, as opposed to which is very vertical or triangular, which is like the hierarchy, right? And actually they build everything as a fractal, and they operate in a fractal mindset, which means that there is no someone up or down, because the definition of Ubuntu is you are the part of the whole, and the whole is making you, right? And so the beautiful thing about this is that basically, one example, for instance, is the judicial system. So today, in the capitalist Western society, the courtroom is a triangle. You have the judge here, and then you have the guilty person in the front, then you have the lawyers, then you have like more people that are all judging that person in the center. In the Ubuntu system, the person that is being accused is at the center, and then is surrounded by his closest people, his family, his friends, and then more close people, and then the judge are all at the border of the center. And because they are not judging just this guy, they are judging the whole community, because the community is actually the one that is also guilty that not have helped that person to avoid this person from doing something bad. And so the whole idea is that if you start thinking individuals as part of a community and the community that is shaping the individuals, then there can be no, like everything is a collective responsibility. And what happens is that in those type of system, cooperation is the norm. Cooperation is the dominant strategy. And if you not cooperate, if you compete, if you defect, then you're going to be accused, and people will try to understand what did we do wrong for this person to become a defector, and then we will try to fix the society, the community, including the person, but we're not just going to take the person, take it out and put it in jail. So it's an extremely resilient system. It's very hard for defector, competitor to actually raise in that system because they get pushed back not through the stick, but through the carrot. Like, let's make sure that this person that stole doesn't need to steal. Why did this person steal? Because we, as a society, put it in a situation in which it was necessary to steal. Now, this is the end of the parenthesis. Going back to the crypto system, if we actually, it's very interesting. It's really beautiful, I think. And what happened basically was that, well, then the colonizer came in and then take the power up and brought the power at the top, and then he created a pyramid, and this absolutely resilient system, because of this radical disruption,
managed to reject it.
They lost the power, and therefore it became.
So he was affected.
But because of this disruption, right now,
but by force.
By force. So where I want to go back to the crypto or to the blockchain, whatever, is that today we are in the same system. We have this absolutely incredible resilient system, which is capitalism, which is the mono tokenization, fiat, whatever, and the only way that we can actually bring this cooperative model back is by actually creating new forms. And disruption could be one solution, but I don't think we need a disruption. It's just about having this, recreating the power at the bottom and creating a resilient ecosystem in which cooperation becomes the dominant strategy. And then to some extent, like, capitalism just become one of them. But because we have many clusters, many other communities, then the power automatically starts coming back into the bottom. And there is the fund, and it's not about, that's why it's not a disruption in terms of let's destroy the existing capitalist system. It's about making it one out of many and giving people a choice. If they want to play the market game, they can play the market game. If they want to play the cooperative game, they can play the cooperative game. If they want to abide by the Ubuntu philosophy instead of the individualistic philosophy, they can, right? And today the problem is that we don't have those alternative settings.
Exactly.
There is no room for this type of things to flourish and to emerge.
Can I add something to what you just said? Because thank you so much. Because fractals are actually what was on my mind. And when I mentioned like the Mbira music, it's about fractals. And I would even go further. Like there's a researcher who showed how fractals are actually a principle for organizing every African primitive societies. I mean, not every, but he studied like Nigeria, he studied different areas, and he studied also like how the spatial organization is fractal per se. So if you take a picture like an Aryan picture of a village, you will see that the fractal principle is everywhere. It's like the way the house of the chief is organized will represent or will be fractal itself, because it will be also duplicated on the whole organization of the village. And you can even find that, or that's a question, I think, but he was observing how this also applied to social organization. So in other terms, instead of having like that anthropological belief that we have one father, one mother, and a child, and that this is pyramids, organization, he will look at like how power is being distributed within primitive African societies under a fractal principle. So in some way, like if your great grandfather was the head of the community, and you have to shared it in a certain way with like his neighbor or his like son-in-law or or brother-in-law, or then you will have like that same principle applied to different level of like social organization and power distribution. So, I mean, it might sound very abstract, but in the end, it's like a very interesting and fascinating way, especially if we talk about computing, and we know that computing allows us to like have a absolute, and this is the first time in history, I think, you know, in the history of civilization, where we can actually look at cultures and civilization by searching for different organizational principles than what we are, the human mind has been, obliged to or limited to because of our cognitive capacities, you know. So coming back to fractal and the resilient, what you're bringing, Prima, is also important, but I want to ask a question. I mean, I would take this conversation, or the question for me now would be, how, you know, like in fractals, everything is sort of like inside everything. You know, it sounds very like a tautology, but it is actually the case. You know, like, so I do believe that blockchain and crypto as an organization can actually allow this, or could bring maybe a fractal organization to life, or to like a more like global perspective. But the question is, like, do you really, like, in fractals, the enemy is the enemy in terms of like, because we also said that, you know, we also agree that there's always like a resistance principle in this organization, and resistance and resilient are always kind of like close to each other. You know, you're resilient because you're fighting, or you have like experienced something that you don't want to experience again, and so you like create that, you know, resilient principle. Yeah, it's chocolate time.
So I just thought it's good to have a little boost.
So
Feel free.
question is, like, how do we make sure that, you know, we can still identify something we don't want within that fractal blockchain principle? Like, so in other words, you know, the enemy are, like, let's say the capitalism, and that's also why I said earlier we should not just always like exteriorize the market, you know, because the market is always a little bit inside. And so the enemy is always like a little bit inside as well, you know, like there's nothing such as a community based on pure values or pure good principles and like a bad exterior, you know, like something that is like, so how do you, so, and that's where the governance thing, the governance conversation is, I think, need to be really brought, you know, like the governance is, how do you really like integrate the possibility to have like accident, to have failures, to have, you know, like, and also like bring back the people, as you said, like the people who were, you know, the bad the bad cop or the bad guys, like how do you actually deal with that?
But I wanna, you
Can
wanna
just very short thing. I think that's a mistake to say that we want to eject the enemy, and I don't even think that the market is the enemy at all. It's just about
The capitalism market.
No, I mean, it's not the enemy. It's just, it's one creature. The problem is that we want to have a choice. And maybe whatever we are designing today is worse. We don't know. The problem is that we have no idea. So it's not about saying you are bad, we are good. It's not about having this pure value system. It's about saying, let's create a field of experimentation. Let's have the market system, which has shown to have some benefits and has been working to some extent in some fashions. But let's also have alternative mechanisms that we can experiment, and many of them will probably fail because we probably just theorize something that doesn't work in practice.
I might raise a point that you probably don't like. Some of them will maybe hit a barrier, and this barrier is likely to be imposed by the capitalist model.
What do you mean, a barrier?
Yeah, because effectively the capitalist model is in control, say, of the military. And when that comes in, then all your experimentations might be capped.
Before we go on that route, I want to go back to your original question and sort of tie it into what you're saying now. It's very interesting what that to pay attention to our own systems and how we're applying to, well, we're designing these new things, right, and experimenting. So I always saw myself, I share this very personal point of view. I always saw myself, I'm from Venezuela, so I'm from the global south. And I moved to New York, lived there for 20 years, and especially, I didn't feel this so much as an artist. I don't think I felt any discrimination as an artist, but I definitely felt it as in the tech world, right? I'm a woman, I'm a Latina,
Oh, yeah.
I have an accent, even though I'm an American citizen, I'm still looked, from the outside. And so I saw myself of this, this construction, because that's my reality, right? Then when I started, and I'm the one designing this system for a global community, and a lot of our artists are, let's say, from, the south of Chile, from, some small town in Peru, from a small town in Kenya. So, and even the European ones tend to be, in some rural area because they want to be off the grid kind of type of people, right? So they are paying the price of being off the grid. And so then I see myself as one of them. And one big lesson that I learned through this process of talking to a community is that because I saw myself as one of them, doesn't mean that they see me as one of them. And so I'm designing this thing for the most part, it's very collaborative, even how we design the incentives and all of this. But at the end, it's a centralized entity, and we have the control, and we are the ones designing. And then I understood that there was actually a thing called, erasing the differences. So I was basically being guilty of erasing the difference between some of the people in those rural areas in the global south and myself. At the end, even though I saw myself at being on the minority on my own reality, I was still brought up wealthy in Venezuela, and I still lived 20 years in New York as an entrepreneur and as a successful artist. And so I still was very much part of the system, and I was acting as if New York never had any impact on me, right? I was acting as if having my social anarchist ideas were predominant, while in fact, my point of view is very Western and very elitist in many ways, even without knowing. So the way I approach this, of not being guilty of that, apart from trying to bring as much as possible all the voices from our community, but that, that's again another governance question, and you have to create the conditions, and the conditions are not there. So what do you do? So the first thing that I think it's been making a big difference, and it ties into what you were saying in terms of, well, do we call it value? Because that's how we call it, it's our framework, is to start changing the vocabulary of how we refer to things and bringing it more into a place that is more coherent to what we're trying to do. So I give you specific examples. While working with a team, if you are in the tech industry, well, then it's very normal to say, the user did this, or how we make the user do that. Well, it's like, this community, I feel very close to them. We know all their names, we know who they are, and it's like, they're no users. You can't, to the design team, don't call them users, they're no users. Because when you're thinking about users, you're designing a specific way. When you're thinking about your friends, you're designing in a different way. Yeah. And so, data is not a brand, right? I hate the whole brand. So what is it? And so we were at a tech startup in New York, and so we have, team, and we have stakeholders, and we have a board of advisors and a board of directors, and we have investors, right? And all of a sudden it's like, okay, so we're doing this thing that it's completely contradictory to the structure of how we're formed we're a company. And a company has very specific structures and a very specific goals that are no longer in tandem with what we're trying to do. So what do you do? Okay, so blockchain helps a lot in terms of making that a little bit more abstract so that you can experiment more. But the fact is that we still have investors, we have to hit metrics, we still have to do certain things, or we don't get money.
Yeah.
Right? So what I've decided, and my co-founder Judy agrees with this, and I think since we've been thinking about this in this way, it has completely expanded our potential, is I just felt very limiting the fact that we were a company. And we had to hit metrics for investors. So we're thinking about it in terms of art. So data is a work of art. The system is, to me, art. I'm looking at it as an artist. And when you look at things as an artist, all of a sudden, all those limitations that you had because of the metrics that you have to hit and because of the ways that disappear. And then the potential is extremely expansive. And so the same will be to how you treat governance, how you treat those values or those principles, how you do it in a way that is completely outside what we're used to, so that you come up with new things or more authentic things from the community. And it becomes abstract, but I think it makes a huge, huge difference when it comes to not being Western-centric or condescendent or trying to fix things for people that have complete different realities than yours.
And language.
And language is a driver of that. It's amazing. Yeah.
Can I use this opportunity? Because I think the time is actually going very fast. But I would like to use this opportunity to actually go back into the question of how blockchain technology is actually providing something new, like a completely different mindset and approach to many things, including to art. I want to use this opportunity to present what I'm bringing to the table in terms of my artistic practice and my attempt to use blockchain technology in order to actually create a paradigm shift, right? And the idea being that my art project is the plantoid, and the idea is the attempt was to create a blockchain-based life form, so creating a creature which is itself an art piece, which has new capabilities that traditional art pieces do not have. One is the autonomy, the sense that it can operate independently of any external party's control. Self-sufficient in the sense that it has the capacity to collect the funds necessary to sustain itself over time, and like any other life form is capable of reproducing itself. And so the plantoid is this kind of android version of a plant, which is the body is the sculpture, but the mind, the spirit of the plantoid is a smart contract on Ethereum. And so the way it reproduces itself is that it receives monies, and at some point there is enough funds in order for the art piece to reproduce itself. And this is when the governance kicks in. And so the consulting advisory board of the plantoid, which are basically the people that have funded it, will select contribution that people will submit to the plantoid, and the vote will be weighted with the actual amount of funds that they have given. And so the governance is such that the more you contribute to the reproduction of the plantoid, the more influence you have in selecting the way in which it's going to evolve. And that's why you get this kind of strange evolutionary algorithm. But the underlying idea is twofold. One is, well, we can now, thanks to blockchain technology, we can give economic agency to inanimate objects, potentially also animate ones like plants, but at least for inanimate ones. And this economic agency is to some extent enabling them to operate according to specific rules that have been specified in their own governance. And all of a sudden, we have like this new experimentation that happens in which artists are no longer the focus of intellectual property or anything. Artists are actually servient to the art piece. And so the idea with the plantoid is that once it has accumulated enough funds, people submit proposition, artists, designer, whatever, submit proposition about how they envision to produce the next version. And then at some point, then the plantoid will transact and execute a smart contract transaction to transfer the funds to the selected winner, who will then be hired by the plantoid, commissioned by the plantoid to create a new copy of itself. And the interesting thing here is that this is actually a new paradigm that was not conceivable before, because simply it was not possible to provide this economic agency to a thing. And now, instead of having like sending money to an artist and hoping that this artist will somehow continue to do work that we like, we can actually fund the artwork itself, and the artwork will then choose, elect who are the artists that are entitled to reproduce the art piece. And the interesting thing here is, of course, that we still need some level of governance. So there needs to be a mechanism incorporated within the plantoid that can figure out like how the selection will be done. And of course, until we get a proper AI system codified into the smart contract, at the moment is based on humans, which is completely okay. The other thing is that this model is also providing a potential economic model for artists, right? And so as any blockchain system, there is also a Ponzi scheme involved. And so whenever the plantoid acquires enough funds to reproduce itself, it's sending some funds to its parent, to the plantoid that created it, and it's sending also a small percentage to the artist that has created that particular instance of the plantoid. And
what's the reason for the presence of that Ponzi scheme, if I may ask?
So
it's part of a plan? Or
yeah, it's part of actually creating an economic model for this. So the idea is that me as an artist...
As an incentive?
As an incentive mechanism. So if you take the copyright mechanism of incentivization, it's based on scarcity and exclusivity, right? As an artist, I have an incentive to keep all my artwork closed up, and then only if you pay for it, I'm going to show it to you. Only if you pay, you might be able to reproduce it or like create derivative work. So it's a very exclusionary and scarcity-based mindset based on intellectual property, right? So we created artificial scarcity in order to enable artists to fund themselves. This model, and that's where the Ponzi scheme, which is it's not a Ponzi scheme, it's a pyramid scheme.
It sounds awful.
I know, Ponzi sounds bad.
Much nicer.
It's a pyramid scheme. It's a positive pyramid scheme. But the idea is that me as an artist, if I actually create this piece, all of a sudden, my incentive is one, to communicate it to the maximum, because the more visibility the art piece gets, the more potential it will receive funds. Secondly, to encourage the remix and the creation of a maximum of derivative works, because the more this particular branch of the species of the plantoids will reproduce, the more I'm going to get potential return on investment, or return on like royalties, if you like. And so, as opposed to having this scarcity exclusivity mindset, you actually have a maximum dissemination and maximum encouraging of reproducing the work, of making it evolve in a ways that follows my own criteria. And so when I create the work, my goal is to create the most interesting one, like to create the characteristic of the work that will be the most popular and that people will want to remix, right? And so it creates an actual very positive ecosystem in which artists want their artwork to reproduce, but at the same time, it's not everyone has the capacity to make like millions of art pieces, right? And so in this way, it's also creating a tool, and that's the protocolism, but it's also creating a tool by which the artist can actually give to the community the responsibility to making the art evolve. Right? So it's kind of like the open source model of like copyleft, but it's actually about the art piece. And it's interesting because it's, as an artist that creates this particular model, the capacity is expanded because you all of a sudden have a worldwide possibility of people that will contribute to expanding the body of your work, right?
Which is a beautiful thing.
Which is really beautiful. And to me, those are like, those are like those specific things. So one is like giving economic agency to the artwork. Secondly is actually giving priority to the artist. The important thing is not that one artist can create a lot of work. The priority is that that artwork can reproduce the maximum. And it doesn't need to be always the same artist that reproduce the artwork. The goal is that we have a maximum variety, an evolution, etc.
How loyal or how compliant it has to be to the original idea, or can it take diversions?
That's the evolutionary algorithm thing. So every artist that creates one instance can codify the DNA. So you can create constraints, obligations, and every descendant of that particular instance has to fulfill all those criteria, and then, but everyone can add more. And so that's how you have like this Darwinism thing in which if you create something that has beautiful properties, then people will want to reproduce that one. Yep. And that particular branch will evolve a lot. If you create properties that are not at all appealing, they are not fit to their own environment, then very few people will actually want to reproduce that one and it will fade. So every artist chooses what is the scope of additional creativity. I mean, the creativity is actually infinite, but what are the constraints that need to be incorporated into every single descendant because they are part of the genetic code?
So what about people who don't, I love protocolism, and I think you actually refined so much the expression of it that it's getting somewhere really interesting. But what about people who don't want to be, who are not even like the same way we asked yesterday, like the people who don't even want to be part of like this contribution network? Like they might, you know, maybe history will show that they have invented like or painted in a certain way or created something that might belong to the same kind of protocol, but their gesture was not meant to be part of something. Their gesture was just meant to be, you know, like what about these people who are in the margin, the people who are, or the cultures or the tribe that, you know, we don't write for, that don't subscribe to any writing or any protocol or any organization.
So the way I see it, I'm sorry, the way I see it is because I want to tie into what you were saying, Primavera, because for me, when I got into blockchain, Plantoid was one of the first inspirations. It really opened my mind into the possibilities of this. So in a way, I think Dada is very similar to Plantoid in the sense that is the system, it's not the artwork, it's the system what controls and reproduces itself. And it's not, it's the artist is the center, or let's say the community is the center, or the art making is the center. So it's about allowing people to just do art. That's the most important thing. And so the economic incentive is within the system, but it's incentivizing people to make art. And I think that what you're doing is, with Plantoid, answers that question that you're saying, because you can make your own rules. But in the case of Dada, there's so many entry points to do precisely that, for that person who just does this type of thing. Of course, it's limited in the sense that it's digital, right? But there's so many different entry points to do what you want, that if the system can sustain you for doing what you want, in our case, that system of incentivization, which is the same for us, it's like you want to incentivize that piece of art to be used and remixed as many times as possible, and just have as many people as possible collaborating with it, because you're always going to have a way to track every
But
contribution.
that's not what I'm asking.
No, but hold on. And then if you're incentivizing that kind of collaboration, and you have people on the margins, like we have some people like that, right? Like that they do their own thing, and they belong to this community because they can actually do their own thing in there, and so. No, that's not what you're asking.
No, I'm asking even like people who, like, I'm really like, let's imagine that some people don't want to belong, you know, like some people don't want to refer to any system, and it's actually interesting because that's exactly what the cyberpunk movement is also about, or like the crypto anarchist movement also. So, you know, like in other ways, like it's fine. I mean, I totally understand like protocolism as some sort of like rhizomatic organization that will, you know, spread a little bit like in the open source philosophy or Ubuntu philosophy, also like will spread some sort of like principles and you know, not forcing anybody really like to, it's not like top-down principles that are interpreted by the people themselves. But I'm just saying, how do you like, you know, how do you just make the possible critique of this system? I mean, some people don't want to be contributors of anything. Some people just want to express something in a way, and they don't, you know, because they don't have the, you know, they don't even want to be reused or you know, part of some, you know, some community or system that will make them maybe safe up to a certain point, you know, like, so it's...
But also, I think, like, just like not everybody needs to be an impressionist or a Dadaist, not everybody needs to be a protocolist, that's the first thing. So if you don't want to be part of a particular...
It's an opt-in.
Yeah, it's completely opt-in. Like an artist can maintain their copyright and do whatever they want.
But then that's where I'm going. The opt-in thing is also very much, you know, based on an idea of like individuals. You know, like if you take...
I understand where you're coming from, but I would like to ask you a question.
Okay.
If I may.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
No, it's yeah. Do you think that those individuals you are talking about are not prone to contribute, or they are feeling perhaps encased into a formal contribution that they are asked to?
I'm talking about people that, you know, that's the same question I'm asking since the beginning of this conversation, which is something that are unheard, something are invisible. Some people are unheard, some people are invisible.
Yeah.
And these people are not even aware that they are unheard and invisible. And we might just let them be, you know? And I'm asking all this because I want to comment, you know, like it's something that also is part of my identity because I was born partially deaf. So it's, you know, I'm constantly considering the possibility for something that is not heard, something that is not visible, because we might use as many protocols and as many writing tools as we want. Something will always like escape to that, and it just has to be this way. You know, it's just there's a possibility for something to be that is not part of like what the rules we're building. So what I'm asking is, so the real like, there's a prejudice in technology, and no matter what kind of technology we're building, and it's prejudice for universality. You know, like we always think that, and you know, you can think through it.
Not
with
necessarily.
good values.
I think this is maybe something that
Can I just finish?
All right.
Sorry, I just want because otherwise I'm not making myself clear.
Okay.
You know, like
Yeah,
and you know, I don't want to. So the prejudice for universality is not that, you know, there's a top-down situation where, you know, the system says, oh, you're all in, you know, like you're all the same and you're all going to be part of that system, you know. But the prejudice for universality is nevertheless that something can be encoded, that this thing can be encoded and can be part potentially of that system, you know. But some real like, and I think that creativity and art especially, and like human forms and life forms in general, don't care about that, you know, like they just are, and they just, you know, like they just belong to radical different worlds than ours. And that's where I stand. That I stand in the idea that diversity is always like linked to a certain like complete foreign system and complete foreign language and complete like you know, like no common measure
I
possibility,
agree.
you know. And so that's just my question was, you know, like how you might discover that some people were, you know, could be affiliated with some kind of protocol, but nevertheless they never were aware of this. So that fact, you know, it's a question of agency, really. I think it's a real question of like what agency do we give to those who are not part of the protocol.
Well, it's also how open you make it, but also we're all multifaceted people. And so when you're talking about these platforms, you know, that's just a little part of you that is in these places, and then you have all these other roles. So for me, I don't know if it's possible to do something without prejudice, but what I know is that I'm focused precisely on the people who are invisible and are on the shadows. This is not something that I'm doing for me and Primavera and our friends. We can make money if we want to as artists, or we have other options not as artists. They're people that the only thing they can do is art, and they can pay the rent the next month. And they know that, and that's how they live. So for me, and they're not noticed because they don't have the access or because they don't live in Europe or in the US, right? So how we create a system in which we actually put light on the people that are on the shadows and let them be. And so the way for me to do it, I think we are experimenting, is, well, first of all, one value for us, or one principle for us is people should be able to make art regardless of their skill levels, regardless of what they want to say, and especially regardless of what the market wants. So they should be able to create, collaborate, and experiment without any pressure to produce. So how do you do that? Well, when you have a collective, and we haven't talked about a big one in crypto, which is ownership,
Yeah.
right? But when you have a collective making artwork or making value, and that value is collectively owned, then you can start thinking about, in our case, well, a percentage of that value that is created is coming back to the community in the form of basic income. If you have someone who is doing their own thing for their own sake, for whatever reasons, they can still survive and keep doing what they're doing because they're going to have that baseline. And you also need the baseline for people to actually act on intrinsic motivations. Otherwise, you need the extrinsic motivations because you're in survival mode. So how you take people out of survival mode, give them or give us a baseline so they can do whatever they want to do and hone their skills and experiment and explore as much as they can in the way they can. That's freedom for me.
But
And
take
I think
people out of survival mode can be interpreted in many different ways. You know, like that's precisely that principle that allowed colonialism. You know, or like in like.
I'm just talking about.
I'm not saying you are. No, but I'm just because that goes back to the question I'm asking. You know, which is like basically, and that's a political conversation that we can't ignore. It's not, you know, like there's. Yeah, that's really like all I wanted to point out, which is like there must be a possibility for something completely foreigner to coexist with that.
Well, you have to do it as open as possible.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think I understand your question, but I'm not sure like why you're asking that question, in the sense that I don't think like anything right now, like to me, like what we're talking about here in terms of like blockchain and like providing tools, mostly for artists, but potentially for other people, is not exclusionary. It's actually we're adding something. If people don't want it, they don't take it. Like this is not imposing, quite to the contrary. No one is trying to impose anything here. It's actually trying to provide new means for experimenting with alternatives to the existing model. But the existing model is there, and if people like it or dislike it, then they stay or they leave, right? So all that we're doing here is actually providing new means for people. If they want to experiment with those new means, then they can. And we're actually like creating tools for artists to experiment with new business model, whether it's Dada, which is creating like some form of collective compensation system, whether it's like Plantoid, which is creating some form of ex-ante funding system for art, which potentially also reward artists afterwards, but no one is trying to say this is the right way. There is no right way anyhow. There is like a multiplicity of possible ways that will be good or bad in a particular settings. But it's not about like, quite to the contrary. To me, those are tools that can actually enhance the capacity of people that might be marginalized in the current system, that now all of a sudden they can actually, they can create their own currency, they can actually collaboratively engage into some community of art, they can participate in like the evolution of something. So it's actually, those tools are potentially helping the people at the margin, but of course they are not forcing them to join into that system.
And also, just to add to that, is like the other things that we're thinking about these things as they have a life of their own. So we're also at some point just surrendering all the control of the thing that we're creating, which means that it could go anywhere. But the trick there is like how you make sure that it stays within like those people that you want to empower, or those type of creativity that you want to empower to keep happening and not to be disrupted or corrupted, right? But you are surrendering the control so that it can become something bigger.
The thing is that we are in this wonderful time, which is like, this is my own fascination for the blockchain. I think it's an incredibly interesting observatory and laboratory. Right? It's a little microcosm in which we can play around. We can do like some alchemic experimentation, and looking at this in order to see what works and what doesn't work given that particular small ecosystem, because it's still relatively small. And then potentially, once we have elaborated something and we have tested it within those communities, if it works, we can try and think about how we can transpose it into different settings. But right now, the focus is really like, there needs to be a space of experimentation. There is no space anymore in the world, maybe in virtual games, but we cannot experiment with governance, we cannot experiment with economies, because there is no space.
And also learning.
And maybe there will be a lot of mistakes. I'm sure most of those models might fail, and then we will learn from the failures and we will improve them. But it's all about providing new ways and new alternatives of experimentation.
In fact, typically we don't question the individuals on whether they can be part of a model, such as a protocol model. We actually question if the model is fit to give an answer and possibilities to these individuals that are typically excluded. So we are trying to be as inclusive as possible, as especially my type of work. So I come from a perspective where inclusion is key, and I always question the model that I bring along. And I would like the whole crypto movement and the whole blockchain to keep doing so, because I'm seeing, and this was briefly touched before as a subject, that although it worked as a disruption in what back then happened to be a few years ago a relatively stagnant IT industry, it brought on a disruption that was very beneficial and ignited a lot of creativity. And my fear is that now that we scratched the surface and we brought along, say, the two major efforts, Bitcoin and Ethereum, that we carry on following that sort of approach instead of experimenting new approaches, because typically what I see is, plenty of other blockchain efforts that are introducing minor changes, not step changes. So it takes a lot of courage to go on a revolutionary side on that.
And a lot of imagination, I would say.
Absolutely. And I would encourage people to keep doing so, and especially when it comes to governance, and before you ask me a question about governance on whether the human should always be involved, or if it could be led by an automatic form of AI, I think we should be open to new possibilities, because I think what I'm observing is that in terms of latency and in terms of capacity to govern these systems, we are hitting some limitations already. So I think we need to acknowledge that as a blockchain researcher, blockchain new startups, and acknowledge it and try to change the model, try to change the approach. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, so to me, like, I mean, I think, again, it's about experimentation. The AI model, we discussed it yesterday, it's not about AI, it's about what is the AI that we are framing.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like the governance structure, like, there are different layers, right? So you have the governance of the blockchain, which is a big deal, because all of those guarantees depend on the actual non-manipulation of the underlying infrastructure, and otherwise there is no proof, there is no accountability, there is no trustlessness at all. So there is the question of, like, what is the underlying governance of the blockchain infrastructure, which we yet have to resolve, because we have either like a plutocratic system or we have a centralized system today. But then we also have like this second layer governance, which is if we deploy specific applications on top of a blockchain, and in that case we need to somehow assume that this blockchain operates as stated, then it's the same thing, like we create those new applications, those new organizations, decentralized organization, and it's actually quite, again, quite disappointing when you look at what are the various governance structures that people codify on top of those decentralized organizations, which are, I don't know why they call them decentralized organizations, because the governance is super centralized or super market-driven. And again, the problem to me is that we have very few models of governance in our mind. We have democratic, and unfortunately, we cannot use the democratic one on a pseudonymous blockchain, so that one is out. And then we have plutocratic, market-driven. Well, that's pretty much what everyone is actually doing within the blockchain space. And it's kind of like, it's a paradox, because if the goal of actually deploying a decentralized organization is because you want to have a distribution of power, then, I mean, if you're talking about decentralization, you have like the decentralization of the infrastructure, which arguably is decentralized, but if the power of the infrastructure is centralized, then you didn't achieve anything. And to me, the paradox that is existing today is between, for the sake of distribution of powers, you're actually using a decentralized infrastructure, but this decentralized infrastructure, because it doesn't come with a proper governance, is leading to a super concentration of powers.
Absolutely.
And so, like, this whole narrative towards let's do a decentralized system without coming with like a proper governance infrastructure will never work. And the problem is that our minds are actually never have been acquainted to a distributed governance system that is not a market system, right? And that's where I think we have this opportunity with the blockchain to explore and experiment those alternative form of distributed governance, right? And there is a few initiatives that are actually doing it, but it's still very experimental, and we actually need to deploy. Like, we need to test it with communities. And the only way, like, the same thing, like, the market is theoretically a very nice decentralized system, but you cannot just look at governance in a static manner. Like, statically, Bitcoin is a decentralized system of governance. Dynamically, if you actually look at the dynamic governance of it, then you should take into account the progressive economies of scale and concentration of power, right? And market is this thing that is theoretically decentralized, but in practice is never decentralized. We don't have one market that maintains a distribution of power unless there is a governmental intervention to actually enforce competition on the market. So either you create a plutocratic model and then you have an institution that makes sure that the plutocracy is not being concentrated, or if you don't want the institution, then you shouldn't actually adopt a market system. And then we're left with nothing. We don't know. We don't have a...
Let me add just that free markets in particular tend to produce a winner-takes-all distribution of outcomes, which is why it becomes plutocratic, right? Mm-hmm. And so you tend to have star systems in which few people gain most of the benefits and a long tail of people who just get nothing, right? So, and the problem is that technology amplifies a winner-takes-all distribution. So now you have free markets being amplified by technology and this ultra concentration of power and money in a few. So we have to think about systems, and what you said is totally true. Like the only times in which we have seen the market being producing a stable middle class was when there was heavy regulated, right? So you need those levies. So to me, it's like, okay, so how you go out of all of that and create something that is new and gives different outcomes.
Now, how do we get like a fresh mind without being like indoctrinated by everything that we know
exactly
today?
Why I was asking this about the fact that we don't no, but that's exactly where I want to, like why I was asking why we might not, do we need a system? Like really, do we need, if we can't envision,
but a fractal is a system, right? A fractal organization will be a system. Like that's what it would, or some type of organization, right? Maybe we shouldn't call it a system, because maybe system implies some kind of standardization. But an organization that will be like a fractal organization, there will be very different nucleus of the ramifications of different communities, or different motivations or interests or whatever. Yes.
No, I have a proposal to respond to this request of what we should focus on, and I think the newborn, blockchain industry, rather than being stagnant itself in its in how it's been conceived so far, I think it should put its effort primarily on types of governance, on new approaches for governance, and give up this intention to provide this decentralization at that level. There are different levels of decentralization, and there are some that, to me, look more interesting than others, because the current decentralization was motivated by breaking free from the control and possibly corruption of a centralized system. But actually, there's no one that has succeeded in terms of scalability and latency. The only system that succeed in bringing on board that many involved actors, that many people, are centralized systems. They work better, so let's face the reality.
But they're more efficient. But that's a different.
They're more efficient. They consume less electricity,
they do not
resources.
Of course, centralization is always more efficient, but they do not come with those technological guarantees that the blockchain provides. Like if you have a centralized governance of a blockchain, then there is no accountability as to the fact that it cannot be manipulated. Like the history can be changed. Censorship. Yeah, and it can be censored.
I would go towards a centralized approach that is devoid of the meaning. So, for example, an opaque centralized approach, in which if an actor has a motivation to take control of that, there's little that they can do. On the centralized approach, only verification can be executed. So the actual data can be stored somewhere else. And I think I would be in favor of bypassing this problem, because simply I notice that we are not capable of resolving it right now. Focusing on governance, which is far more interesting problem. And also, in terms of decentralization, what I find very, very interesting is to break free from how currently the way we operate and we interact in society is defined by 5 major organizations out there, which are large corporations that define effectively how we operate on a daily basis.
Companies.
The internet companies, the social, yeah, Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc. I didn't want to bring names on the table, but that's what I'm referring to. So that they effectively define how we operate, and typically I sense that creative minds find themselves encased. So we are pretty far from what you, Stefan, reckon would be an optimal solution, which will provide inclusion also for, or even not inclusion, as you mentioned.
I think just to clarify, I think we just need to think also that there might not be solution, because the fact of thinking technology as a problem-solving thing is always like trapping us into the same, paradoxes and domination / is dominated, dominant / is dominated. So just my point was to say, and that's why I really think that Dadaism was about that. It's about there's a power for imagination and for that is also a political thing, like when I say, what about the unheard? What about the invisible? What about the people who are not even who don't want to be part of they don't want to subscribe to any sort of organization because they might not need so. And that goes, let me take it further, if it might make my argument clearer, which is, what about the inanimated object? What about the natural resources? What about the plants? We might have to surrender at some point to this idea of individuals and subjectivity and minds to just accept that some things are, and inside the mind itself, I love governance, because it's the word we've been using to sort of trying to make this conversation go somewhere where we can actually, there's an idealist standpoint in governance discussion, right? So governance is also about, how do you unexpected things, unexpected things can be, you must take them for what they are. They are unexpected. So the same way you govern a community, you govern yourself. Sometimes you might have some thoughts, imaginative visions, some pulsions, some emotion that are completely new and completely not, they don't fit into any language, they don't fit into any potential prediction of what, and that one of the essence of the artistic expression also. So I think I just wanted to try maybe take the blockchain. I mean, I think that we might need to go back to blockchain versus crypto. Crypto, blockchain might be it's an infrastructure. It's a language, it's a computing power, but crypto is not just blockchain. And I think that this eventuality, this possibility, must also be part of of any conversation on blockchain, so that we make sure that we're not designing blockchain as some sort of superpower. Superpower system, basically.
Okay. Yeah, I want to. I think it's of course, hopefully nobody thinks that, at least not in this bunker. But I think it's actually
some people do.
Some people do.
I think it's still cheap. It'd be great if after this conversation you just keep us in check once in a while in each of our projects.
But I think it's there is a distinction between. So there is the approach. Many people outside of this bunker, which see that blockchain is this trustless infrastructure in which we can codify everything, and everything is self-executing, and we don't need humans anymore in order those corrupted minds, right? And this is kind of on the one hand, this concept of trustlessness does not exist, because trust is just somewhere else, and you're just shifting trust from a centralized institution to a decentralized network of miners, mostly located in China. But secondly, is also like, do we really want a trustless system? Like, do we really want a system in which we don't have trust relationship and in which everything is just pre-codified? Of course not. No one except some people outside of this bunker wants that. But on the other hand, I think it's also important to look at technology as an affordance, right? And whether it's cryptography is a fantastic thing. It brought the possibility for people to communicate in private. And this is actually, that doesn't mean that cryptography is resolving everyone's problems, but it is an affordance that is necessary for this actual communication to take place in a private manner. So, and the blockchain, I think, is another one of those affordance, right? So the goal is not really to create a trustless society. I think none of us is really trying to do that. However, if the goal is to actually build trust, right? The blockchain technology, to me, is actually this mechanism that is building confidence. So you can build confidence in a particular infrastructure. And because of the confidence that has been enshrined into the operation of the infrastructure, then it actually becomes possible, or easier at least, to create trust relationship on top. Because I don't need to trust Facebook about everything that they are doing, because I know that they are constrained at a particular degree in some operations, and those operations I have confidence in the way they operate, and because of this an increased degree of confidence, then I feel much more comfortable actually taking the trust relationship to this person, to this institution, or whoever I'm interacting with. So to me, in the same way as cryptography was a required affordance for peer-to-peer private communication, then blockchain is an affordance to create this confidence and this accountability in the people I interact, which the ultimate objective is not to get rid of trust, is actually to create the building blocks on which trust can actually be rebuilt and restored.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wanted to say one thing about cryptography and the possibility to engage in private conversation, which is appealing from one end, but also dangerous from another end. So in some circumstances, this is a tool that might be used for purposes that are not generally perceived as positive. For instance, the notion on how to build weapons is circulating very, very fast. And even the funding of this operation circulates very fast on blockchain opaque system that don't give the possibility for a centralized authority to inspect.
Another one will be like sexual abuse for children.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think to an extent it's fascinating what cryptography enables you to do, but from the other angle is also quite dangerous, and we need to be aware that by decentralizing we also open up this kind of worm.
Absolutely, and I think that's like every technology is a dual edge, right? Every technology that can be used for amazing, beautiful things can also be used for terrible things, right?
Absolutely.
And the problem is that there is no possible way in which you can provide one and prevent the other if it's not from the outside, by creating social norms, institutional norms, whatever system that is actually promoting certain usage and punishing other usages, right? But I mean, that's like the problem with like Tor and like with everything, is like a technology that is sufficiently secure to enable activists to communicate privately will also be sufficiently secure to enable terrorists to communicate securely.
Absolutely.
And the question is, do we just want to get rid of the technology because there are potential terrorists to use, or do we actually want to promote the positive use of the technology and try to dissuade to the maximum the negative usages, right?
I will agree with you that it's possible to create these incentives to, like in our case, it's very simple. Like either, like it's completely open, you can draw anything and you can be anyone. So of course there will be people drawing dicks, right? Or so you create the incentives, but also you design the system in a way in which there will still be people drawing dicks, but they may not have the motivation to do it because nobody's going to see them, for instance. They can still do it, but it won't have any impact, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, you can still do that.
And I think there is also the power of the community. So to my platform, which I think I showed you, the Kopfschlag, which was basically not similar to that, but like a wide canvas where everyone can write anonymously and delete other people. And at the beginning, we were really afraid. Like we started it in like 2007, and we were like, "Oh my God, it's gonna be full of dicks, like or like insult and whatever." And interestingly, of course, you cannot avoid the dicks; they always happen. But because it's a community thing, it's super cute. Like whenever there is a dick coming up, all of a sudden the community doesn't even delete it, transforms it. And then you see this dick that becomes like an animal or become a face, And so you have this community moderation, but it's not based on censorship, which is really important. We don't decide, you can flag it up and down. No, the community itself will react because the social norms, they don't want to see this dick, and so they just change it and make it evolve into something beautiful.
Yeah, and I will say that when you're left by itself, when you don't have that type of community social norms, what happens if you go to there are hundreds of these like real-time drawing applications? It's all dicks,
because there is no community behind.
Because there is nothing that will prevent that from happening. So,
and I think in terms of like the problem that you were raising is, of course, like whenever you are in a closed system where it's basically just terrorists communicating with each other, of course, good luck, However, when you're like in a community system and some people want to see something like, let's talk about hate speech, right? Mm-hmm. So the community might not actually want to be in a system in which there is hate speech, and they can moderate. They can actually somehow neutralize
precisely.
it. Right?
This moderation element is what I want to bring on the table.
But it doesn't need to be top-down. It can be community-driven.
Or it could be automatically driven.
That's my hope. But then there's a problem with AI and like content ID and all this stuff in which they start censoring everything that they think might be bad, and most of it is actually not
obviously,
bad.
with current systems, I would not be in favor of that, especially if they are driven by machine learning, which is tends to be biased. And
but the problem, I think, before you, but I will pose you this like very objective, pragmatic example. And this is what happens with Facebook and these things. But there are people that draw nudity in data. Very often we don't censor anything, that's art, right? How is an AI going to differentiate between a beautiful dick that somebody did because it's actually an anatomic study, and a dick that somebody just did for the purpose of trolling? There's no way. You cannot do that. You need a governance system on top of it.
And also monitoring, I would suggest.
And you need, specifically, I think, a system of incentives that...
But some people have, and I'm referring to people that don't have the intention to participate positively in a community. They want to disrupt things. Perhaps they have they come from this background. They have this type of motivation.
You just disincentivize them. That behavior.
But if these people are feeling excluded, they might develop an incentive of their own that is just to disrupt a system. And effectively, I'm talking also about cases in which trolling is even leading to people committing suicide or something very, very bad. So, and this has to be taken into account as we develop a system with a governance and with an inclusive and independent sort of approach.
Of course, well, it's like what I was telling you yesterday. Data is completely open. We don't censor anything. That's a principle.
Mm-hmm.
There's no censorship whatsoever. It's open to anyone, yet there is no trolling and there is no bullying.
But you can afford keeping it that way until an accident happens, and then things get pretty sour.
Well, the thing is that what's preventing that from happening is the actual system and is the community. So it does neutralize that kind of behavior.
That's an optimistic way of seeing it.
No, it's not optimistic. This is objective because it's actually happened. I mean, data has years, and what I was telling you yesterday is not. And this is what I think is important. And coming back to the way you see things, right? Like, it's not that this is a beautiful community where everybody is nice and kind. We all. I mean, we have people who are. Mental issues, illness, like there's all kinds of things there. But you can see the same people behaving toxically in Facebook and in Twitter, and they don't behave that way on data. And I think the incentives, again, are the crucial differences. Because when you think about the social networks, the thing that it's because of the business model of social networks like Twitter and Facebook and Reddit, the business model is based on growth at all costs, so that you can get as many data that you can sell, right? That's the business model. We know now that the fastest, easiest, deepest way to engage people is outreach. So if outreach is the what causes the deepest engagement, and for your business model you need the most engagement possible, then you are going to incentivize outreach, and the algorithm are going to incentivize outreach, and so it's a vicious circle, right? So if you think of it completely different, and this is why it's so important, crypto in the equation is how we figure out different business models or different, I wouldn't even talk about business model, a different way of self-sustain for these projects or communities in a way that the incentives take care of the behaviors of the community, and automatically that governance will be filtered by those motivations.
Okay, can I ask just a brief question and then I pass it over to you? Now, how do you recognize the fact that, for example, nowadays people relate in an empathic way towards a character, mainstream character like the Joker in the recent movie? So this, to me, is a type of feedback that I want to interpret about our society. And it is a different Joker compared to the one that we used to relate to when we saw previous movies. This went mainstream, and it got a lot of people involved. And I think the message is, yes, there's something unpleasant for the individual that goes ahead in our society, and that is a reaction that people are inclined to relate to, as opposed to the one that you are bringing on the table, which I think is much more constructive. So, but how do you relate to a mainstream event that is going in that direction? How do you involve as many people as possible in an effort that is more constructive and more cooperative?
What I'm saying, I think it is in the basis are the incentives. That is what is motivations is what drives our decisions. So if you incentivize the motivations to collaborate, that's going to have an outcome that is different from incentivizing motivation to compete, right? So competition is going to drive the winner takes all outcome, while collaboration is going to drive to a cooperation type of organization, right? So, and it's not that one is better than the other, because collectivism can be really bad too. It's just that on the very basics, our behavior drives our decisions. And what these companies are doing is basically modifying our behavior.
Yeah, I think this is like an illustration of exactly like the media has so much power to actually change the mindset of people. And today, our medias are like, whether those are social medias or like the Hollywood industry and whatever not, they are actually passing a very specific types of message. And what we want to do is actually pass a completely different type of message and actually create an alternative or a coexisting parallel system in which the message is actually, we want to all collaborate. And the intuition, so I think a lot in community in terms of gravity as opposed to boundaries. I don't think whatever, how we define communities, but the gravitational force, right, is a fundamental thing that makes people orbitate around a particular community. And today, we have these very strong forces around like all those like traditional social media, whatever, very, very strong. It's really expensive, costly, like for like social cost to move from one to the other. The question is, can we actually create systems which start small? They start with like a small gravitational force, but it's people that are very aligned with those values, and they really become stronger by cooperating. And if we actually believe that cooperation will lead to a maximization of the happiness, I guess, or of the creativity, of the production, of the value of those community, as people gather around this gravity, they become stronger, they attract more people, the gravity becomes stronger, and eventually more and more people start orbitating. And there might be a point, maybe in the long term, in which the cooperative model has become so strong, kind of like Wikipedia. Wikipedia, there is no way any commercial encyclopedia could ever compete with Wikipedia because it has attracted sufficient gravity that everyone is already there, and the cooperative model is so much more productive than the competitive model. And so if we manage to create those small spaces of cooperation and experimentation, and if there is an initial group of people around that enjoys that actually feel better, that actually feel that they are producing better value, then we can hope that more and more people will eventually move. And the ultimate long-term ambition, if we succeed with our experimentation, is that you don't need to fight the existing model because people will just naturally orbitate away and towards the cooperative model. And there will be a point in which it actually makes sense to just go to the cooperative model. And so to me, like, that's the thing, like, we are not even competing with the competitive model. We are just creating an alternative space. Even if this never happen and this still maintain the main gravity, at least the people that are aligned in values, and the Joker people will stay with the Hollywood. That's fine. But the people that do not like Joker, they can come to those alternative model and they can increase the value of those model, and at least they can peacefully coexist. And if one day we manage to become stronger with the collaborative model, then it's going to shift, and then this will just collapse out of nothing because there is just no more gravity there, right? But because the time is gone,
no,
I will suggest, I would like to, as an ending, if we can each say like what is the very short message that we want to give to the broader crypto community.
Yeah.
You
Go
wanna
ahead.
start? No.
Okay.
Please.
No, the short message is kind of echoing what I said before, in the sense that, we went one step ahead into exploration. Let's keep exploring. Let's keep trying to build something disruptive in a responsible way, and with tools that impede disruption by single individuals who have intention to create a lot of damage. So that's my message.
So I will take it from there. I think I hope that we can keep experimenting as much as possible, as you said. But I will. This is for, you say, for the crypto community, right?
Yes.
Okay. So specifically for the crypto community, I think one of the biggest problems is that I see people just bringing the old frameworks into this new technology.
Correct.
And I think the danger there is that they're still calling it innovation and new systems when it's really the old ones. And so I think it really is not because people are evil or they just want to do the money or do the easy. There's some like that. But for the people who have good intentions, I just think it's very difficult to think about new things. It requires a lot of imagination, and it requires really a deep
exercise.
Understanding of your own self and your surroundings. And so I think experimentation is what drives that and allows for that to happen.
Absolutely, and go the unconventional route. Force yourself to try to break these embedded models that you have inherited, and try to think unconventional. Creative is what I say, but
Creative,
unconventional.
treat it as art. Yeah.
And I will add to this, like my own invitation to the crypto world is actually, I think artists have like so much to contribute, because if there needs to be creativity, it needs to be creativity like, how do you get outside of this box? And it's super hard, like even as an academic, it's super hard to think outside of this like big, even if maybe you have like a larger box, it's still a box. And I think like artists, they have this wonderful capacity of like imagining what could be, and like thinking completely outside of the box. And I believe like the actual disruption that might come within the crypto world will potentially be the best inspiration is actually like artistic thinking. And also, in addition to this, I think like, especially like when you have those technologies that are not yet mature and so forth, there's this thing that I've been observing a lot, is that everyone has like a particular type of constraint, right? So if I'm an engineer, I'm constrained by functionality. If it doesn't work, I cannot do it. If I'm an entrepreneur, I'm constrained on return on investment. If it doesn't make money, I won't do it. If I'm a lawyer, I'm constrained with the legal system. If it doesn't make sense from the legal system, I cannot do it. And the artist actually has this beautiful lack of constraints. And indeed, most of the incredibly interesting innovation in the blockchain space, at least, I have seen it coming from artists, because whether it works or not, it doesn't matter. Whether there's return on investment, we don't care. If it's not legally compliant, even better. So they can actually like do things that don't work, that don't make any sense, and yet it's there, and that's what can then inspire other people from like the real world to then look at what has been done, what has been imagined by the artists, and then try and make it make sense in their own framework. But the initial innovation comes from the artist.
I agree.
Yeah, so I want to just, it reminds me of something, Nietzsche would write about painters, and he would say that, the Renaissance painters, in spite of having like matter that were imposed by, the power, so basically they had to paint Christianity and like Christian matters. And the most interesting thing about Renaissance painters is that they would be able to express the contrary of what they had to paint just by, their own creative gesture. And I think that probably the most beautiful thing about the crypto concept, which is like, indeed you are encoding something that you can't get back to. So in some ways you're like, there's a real question there, which is like, how do you allow crypto to remain transgressive so that it can not include in a way that, we have to include the impaired or the, dominated or the minorities, but in the sense that we can always open a possibility for something that is not there yet to, coexist, and maybe like shut down the system in the end, because the whole point of like having a system is also to be, to be able to collapse.
Yeah.
This is wonderful. We should go into bunkers more often. Let's find a bunker in Paris or something.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That was
Thanks.
wonderful.
This was great. Thank you.